Now we have a panel discussion. There are 4 participants. Kaja Kell from the Bank of Estonia. She is responsible for the Language and Publications Department. Helve Trumann from the Chancellery of the Parliament. She is a translator. Kadri Vider from the Language Resource Center, and Margit Kurm from Tilde Estonia. She is the head of Tilde Estonia. And we are talking about bilingual data in the infosystems of state institutions, how they should be used. Hello everyone, I will start this discussion. I have been working in the field for 15 years and we do work quite a lot for the public sector. So I do have sort of a bystander view of things. I've had a chance to see what could be done differently. So I've also had a chance to think about what kind of data could be in multiple languages in our institutions. And I have to say that I've noticed a whole host of these of data that ministries and all kinds of state instances use a lot. Depending on the year, there may be 23 or 15 translation-themed procurement. But I've never noticed that they ask for both, for bilingual text to come back. So my suggestion would be that since the texts that are meant to be translated, they have about 30% of this reusable part, or these repetitions. Whenever you make the next procurement, you can put it into the requirements that you want both texts back, and you can have those texts sent to Kadri Vider and the Estonian Language Resource Center then, so that it could be used. Now, here I listed some of the procurements that stood out for me. I want to move to the next slide. Okay, here we go. And here I have some information. It's an analysis of a client guide. It's a client that we had for quite a long time. And here you can see how much of help translation memory can be. If you look at the first row, all source words on the right-hand side. So it's over 15,000 words that are in the manual that they wanted to translate, and you see how many repetitions there are. So actually, not everything has to be translated again, and there are 3,410 instances where the text overlaps and it has already been edited, so it could be used very well in the end text already. But today, the Chancellery of the Parliament, as well as the Bank of Estonia, will be talking about their experiences with the translation and what kind of multilingual materials they have, how much volume they have in terms of data, what kinds of formats these documents are in, how they have organized translation, who needs it, who is responsible for ordering them, who uses them, who reuses them, and where is this information stored. And now I would like to give word over to Helve from the Chancellery of the Parliament. I would like to briefly talk to you about how translation is carried out in the Chancellery of the Parliament. Now, first of all, what do we translate? The Parliament, the Chancellery's main task is to facilitate the Parliament's work, and for that we also offer the translation services. We only work for Parliament members, and in broad terms I would divide them into regular translation and then non-regular ones. Regular ones, for example, are press releases, plenary schedules, overviews of the plenary meetings. They're all published. Running basis, so to speak. These may be presentations at international conferences, speeches, letters, requests for information materials, all kinds of brochures and books about the Parliament. Here I have some very general statistics about the language pairs. From Estonian to English and back, it's about 2,000 pages a year. Estonian Russian, about 1,500, and Estonian French, Estonian Finnish, considerably less, 60 and 10 respectively. And other languages are even less frequent. We also have a terminology base that was launched last year. STL Multiterm is what we use, and right now it contains about 4,000 terms in 3 languages, Estonian, Russian, and English. And we use the standard of 1,800 characters with spaces per page. How is translation organized? We have 6 translators in our department. And we also have a stenography and translation department deputy chair. 3 translators have English in their work as their working languages, 3 have Russian, and they all have additional languages that they use if needed, French, German, Finnish, for example. And regular translations, we have an agreement with the client. So the client being usually the public relations department, they know exactly whom they send which text, and that's how we get it done as operatively as possible. Other texts, they first go to the deputy head of our department, and they are responsible for distributing it among the translators. We use STL Trato Studio as a translation tool. And just last week, we started using the 2015 version. We have translation memories that dates back to 2002. And when it comes to the Estonian English memory, we have about 200,000 translation units. From English into Estonian, 130,000, and from Estonian to Russian, about 60,000, and other languages are less. When it comes to reusing information, as you know, in translation memories, you have phrase-based translation units. 70 to 100% correspondence is used automatically. And it also has a search function for terms and phrases. But what is repeated in our translations, the types of text where we have a lot of repeats are basically meeting reviews, schedules, bios, and websites, where not a lot changes. And when they do come into translation every 4 years, they tend to be quite similar. And what is repeated, draft laws, for titles of laws, draft laws, all kinds of proceedings, the contents of drafts, contents of bills. The first, second, and third reading, the report is made on the contents of the discussion, and it might not change every time, so we have a lot of repeats there. Now, the structure and the organization of the Parliament and the Chancellery, those are also texts that are repeated a lot. The names of institutions, titles, and so on. But if you look at the general capacity or the general amount of text, we don't have that much repeats yet, because when it comes to press releases and speeches, then those definitely have less. And that, in brief, is all from me. Let's move on to the Bank of Estonia. Hello, I am representing the Bank of Estonia today. And I think my talk will be more about doubts and fears rather than big success stories. But let's get started. But by the way, I would be very happy if somebody removed my doubts. Here we have a figure about the part of our work. It shows how many indicators we have to pass on to international institutions about the Estonian economy. Here we have the number of indicators in millions, and it's growing at a very nice speed. Why? Because forwarding information is becoming more comfortable, and the more they get, the more they want. And if you ask me what language is all this data in, I would say that it's not a human language that these documents are in. They're in computerized language. And whether they will be in English, German, French, or Estonian in the future, that is only determined in the data entry level. So the data is separate from the layer in which it is actually forwarded to the instances that need it. What we use on our website looks like this. We have it in 2 languages, in Estonian and English. And this layer of information right now contains, let's say, 35 different tables about the Estonian foreign economy, about the financial sector. And one table can have tens of thousands of numbers, and that's why they have also been categorized differently. If you look at the Estonian balance, for example, budget balance, then that would be huge. Or if you look at the balance of payments, it's a very long list of indicators. Now, something that I was thinking while I was listening here today that could be very interesting and useful to everybody who works with this type of data would be if our language resource center, if it has not done so, if they would do the same things that our statistics collectors do. Because oftentimes, what happens is we would like to translate a line of data, make it more Estonian, make it better. But once we have it in the statistics classifier and it has been translated one way, If we change it, then it will cause a lot of confusion among those to whom we submit our data. So we've been thinking about how to organize a kind of a cleanup. So it would be a very big step forward to a clear Estonian language, and it would improve the language situation. As I mentioned, data is in one language. That means numbers aren't translated. But actually, the format is also important, whether it has a comma or a point or a space in between the numbers. That's also different. But now when we talk about texts, then the Bank of Estonia basically translates all of the content that reflects its work. Something that we do not translate is document registries. They are as they are, and they are available as is. Now, when we translate from Estonian into English, it's done in-house, and it is done by somebody who speaks English as a native language, and it is also somebody who has obtained a degree in translation from a university in England. So, in that sense, we don't have doubts as to the quality. And I think we have really no use for translation memories. We also translate a lot of the European Central Bank materials. Those are translated from English into Estonian. That we don't do in-house. We order it, subcontract it, and then we edit it in-house. And we do keep a translation memory for those texts. And for years, it has been in our procurement requirements that it's been set in the requirements how this translation memory can be used and who it belongs to. And I think we're the only organization here who has passed on a translation memory to the University of Tartu. If I'm wrong, please raise your hand. I think it was about 10 years ago we entered into agreement with the University of Tartu. I don't exactly remember the clauses of that contract, but I do remember that the university did not have permission to pass it on. And that translation memory basically went down the rabbit hole. I do not know if it was of any use. But now we do regret that silly mistake. We wish they would erase it, and we are much smarter now. When it comes to economic language, and the economic language in Estonian wasn't developed well enough. So that's why we want it back, because the language has developed so much in the meantime. Another topic that kind of makes me doubtful is the aspect of copyright. If we buy services from a translation company, then the issue of copyright is more or less fixed. But when it has to do with the European Central Bank, then the ECB is also a party, and we have to consider the copyright for them. And I think that we may not get permission from the ECB to pass on the texts for MT or for research purposes. I have been speaking with my colleagues informally for over the past few days, and from what I gather, the ECB is looking into machine translation, and it is useful. For example, let's say that a Slovenian lawyer linguist has to know what a Swedish law says, then they put it through this machine translation, and then in broad terms they understand what the situation is. It's too bad my colleague from the Ministry of Economy and Communication left already, because he knows more about translation, the translation of these European texts. We are very much interested in facilitating the translation of these European legal texts. And it would be also good to review or look over, edit the texts that have already been translated a long time ago. Then there are the procurement documents. Procurement documents could be translated by machines, and that would be a very welcome change, because that would mean that my little neck of the woods would not have to deal with that. It's quite standard, and these open calls are also all quite standard. They deal with the same issues a lot. Here I have quite a few questions, but please tell me that these are stupid questions, and here I would like to be convinced otherwise. First, I would like to ask, for what could we use MT right now, right here and now? What can we use it for in the future? Okay, I heard a few things about the vision for the future here today. Another question. If we give researchers a part of our translation memory, would it be possible to share it out by different fields? Because in the field of economy, of course, the breakdown is also very varied. There are very many different branches to the economy, of course. And taking into account the developments over the past years, when we started refreshing our website 10 years ago, we talked about having a common base, a common database for translating, so that all the state institutions could use. And when I asked about where it was, what was keeping it, then I found out that it was just held up by all kinds of disputes and arguments, so it never came to be. So would it be possible to have some fields or some principles that we could agree on to not have these types of disputes, so that we could move forward, that it wouldn't just die off, that we could get started, get to it, to have a system that everybody could use? Now, another painful issue is old translated legal acts. Could we please, if we have a translation memory that everybody uses, could we please not use the old translations, which were not good? And if we look at graphs and tables, of course you can adjust what kind of data that you use to make these graphs. But if a person chooses too much, you can use a regular translation memory and get 200 corresponding hits, for example, and you don't know what to use. If somebody goes to search in this system, for example, that they wouldn't get too much material at one time. Thank you very much, and those are the questions from my end. The interpreter cannot hear without a microphone. I'm afraid that in that case the volume would be just so big. A microphone to the speaker, please. I don't think it won't fit in the cloud, but I do feel bad for the translator who has to choose from 200 different hits. I think this translator will become tired before they find the right answer. Our experience is that we have cleaned our translation memories. Our old things, we just do away with them because it makes the working memory slower. Plus, it's good to clean things every now and then. And working memory, if we're talking about Trados 2014, we have been talking about with other central banks, if you keep everything in your memory, then for some operations it gets so slow, then it's just not useful anymore. What I wanted to say is that we can't really focus on the particularities of a certain type of software, because that's definitely not something that our center deals with. But the linguist in me says that there's no such thing as too much information. But I would never erase anything, but of course you can filter things. Knowledge can be filtered, and if that is of use for a translator, that the memory's age is so great, then you have to adjust the software that it kind of notifies the translator of the age of this memory, for example. And then Mark talked about the evaluation feature of the software, what might be better suited, what might be less suited. Of course, hits will always be kind of in the gray area, but then the experts themselves, the translators, they can decide what is best suitable. Unfortunately, I don't know the translation memory product field too well, but I think it should and could involve an evaluation element. This evaluation mechanism could very well be applied to the translation memory. It could be used to evaluate a person's translation, for example. If a person has used, let's say, 1,000 of the right phrases, and if a machine was taught to recognize these, then it could also recognize which is a better solution in a translation made by a human. That is true on the one hand. However, something that may be correct in one context or preferable in one context might not be best in another context. Of course, that could be filtered in a way as well, I suppose. I'm not sure whether you got answers to all your questions. What I gathered from your questions were a few keywords. Age, for example, to delete the old things, I would argue against that. And the second thing, I understand that translations have to be accurate, correct. And the question is, how do we achieve that? But correctness is also an evaluation. How can translation memory help a person in addition to the corresponding terms? There could also be evaluations assessed to those terms. And according to these evaluations, maybe that would help filter the terms. Because in dictionaries, for example, you have notation for those terms that are not used anymore that often. We have a very narrow field of central bank yearly reports. We have a separate memory for that because across Europe there are very different requirements for these reports, and it's very peculiar, or particular rather. But I don't think it would be good for statistical analysis. Another thing I noticed that I thought I would perhaps comment on. As far as I know, legal acts are not under copyright. When we talk about translating European law, we could talk about the translator's copyright. However, since they are translating the contents that are basically not burdened by copyright, then as far as I know, then it shouldn't be not available publicly. I don't argue with that at all. But what has to do with the ECB, it's economic policy texts, and there definitely copyright does apply to translations as well. And I think it's also a part of just polite communication that when we use this type of text, and we ask the other party as well who is involved with these texts, who has generated these texts. So copyright would be institutionalized then? The ECB, since they do provide work for translators, then does the ECB hold the rights? Yes. The ECB holds the rights only if they have entered into an agreement that says they do. These copyright issues, unfortunately, yes, they are complicated. And what I wanted to talk about in this panel, I wanted to reiterate my call on everyone that if you have some translated texts in your field, I would very much appreciate if they were donated in the interest of improving machine technology or machine translation. Anything that would be a good learning material for MT would be appreciated. And what kinds are good for the MT systems? For example, you mentioned that your data is mostly in numbers. And basically, what you also have is a title for each of those lines of numbers, for example. But from the materials that you showed us, I did see some longer sentences or titles in Estonian as well. And that's been created by a person, right? Sure, that's been created by people. We can't create those automatically, but of course it would be nice if we could. Because we do have a lot of data corpora, and it would be useful for us. But the information that you mediate to others is only in numbers, yes? Yes, in numbers, and the numbers carry codes. So somewhere you have to have an index that describes the code, right? And this index might be multilingual. I do presume that it is multilingual, yes. For example, in Brussels or Frankfurt or where have you? Aha, so there. That's something that we could use. That's an important multilingual resource that would really help MT and the terminology side of MT. So wherever you have words, phrases that people have written and the corresponding text in a different language, then that's what we need. In the MetaNord project, where Tilde also took part, we had this great task. We had to index the classification of diseases. At least in Europe, all diseases have been classified and they have been coded with numbers. They have codes that start with a letter and it's followed by numbers. And then you have the Latin term for the disease and then the local language term. And all doctors, they understand when they see these codes, they say, aha, he or she has this or that disease. So this is also a resource for terminology. But here again, it would be nice if we had something like this in Estonian and for other languages as well. And oftentimes the Estonian titles or terms are based on this statistics classifier, and they could be changed and they could be improved. Whether it is in good Estonian, that can only be evaluated, fortunately, unfortunately, by a specialist in the field of Estonian language.
Thank you to all the participants. And if you go back to your positions at work later on, then try and think what bilingual resources do you have that could be